It's late in the day, we've been at it all day. Anybody know what is the significance of this date? Is audience participation. Anybody? Take a guess.
Not your birthday.
Correct.
The day after your birthday.
Not correct either.
Oh.
All right, we go. So I'm finding more and more that my cultural references in my slides are becoming dated. This is from a movie called The Terminator, which came out in, what year did it come out? Anyone? I don't know the answer to that. Anyway, who am I? My name's Jeff Mann. I am an information security consultant advisor by day. I'm a podcaster by night. Been doing information security for over 40 years, and they let me come out and speak and mostly tell stories about what I used to do, because I kind of got started in this kind of when this thing was getting started. That's sort of the details of my career. Most importantly, and what people like to hear about, is my time at NSA, and I'll get to a little bit of that momentarily. Paul's Security Weekly, any listeners? Thank you, thank you. Listeners, watchers, some of you have been interviewed before. During COVID, I had a lot of free time, and I got to organize my closet. I do identify at this point in my career as a hacker, and I have the black hoodies to prove it. And one of our loyal listeners helped me by doing a little bit more organization. Anybody remember the Tribe of Hackers series? That came out prior to COVID. I'm one of two people that are in all 4 editions. If you want to know who the other person is, you have to go out and buy the books. I don't get any proceeds. I was on episode 83 of Darknet Diaries. Any Darknet Diaries listeners? Notice my t-shirt. Notice the artwork. Pretty cool. Life goal, not only to be interviewed on Darknet Diaries, but to get the artwork on a t-shirt. I was also invited when I was here to be a member of this curmudgeon CTF thing, so I'm actually an official member of something called the Cabal of the Curmudgeons, which is a bunch of old timers that hang out with this guy. Oh, I'm going to use the laser thing, hold on. This guy here, Gene Spafford. Anybody know who Gene Spafford is? Some of you. If you don't, Bruce, that's his book that you should have bought, which I think I have a picture of it later on to help you identify it. Several years ago, I was at a B-Sides, and I met a guy at a speaker dinner, and I asked him what he was talking on. He said, Introduction to Cryptography. So I went the next day and listened to his talk, and after that, I thought, geez, I should give a talk like that, because I kind of did that back in the day. So I started out in the mid-1980s, 1986, working as a cryptologist for the National Security Agency. Here's my certification. It's the only certification I acknowledge and that I'm actually proud of, although I do have a few other industry certs, but I don't own up to them. I was there sort of at a transitional phase where NSA, on the defensive side anyway, what was called InfoSec, was mostly building little black boxes that got slapped onto radios, and a lot of radio telephone transmission. A lot of the armed forces back in those days were still even communicating with Morse code. I had a customer approach me one time and say, we're using these one-time pads, which are very labor intensive because you're encrypting and decrypting a message one character at a time. And he was actually working with people that were deployed in certain areas of the world that were maybe observing things, and their one-time pad was very small and it would hide in the heel of their shoe. But this guy had a much larger version, but he also had this thing on his desk, this PC, and saying, is there any way that you could like create a program that we could do this encryption and decryption in software? And I was young and naive, and I didn't know the history of NSA, and I said, yeah, that makes sense, why not? So I was able to force a software-based crypto system through an organization that was an engineering organization that just built little black boxes. To the best of my knowledge, this was the first time NSA produced a software-based crypto system. It was half software. The guy in the office got to use the software. The guy in the field was still doing it by hand. A little bit later on, I had another client also using one-time pads, and if you don't know what a one-time pad is, I apologize. Just know that it's the only unbreakable crypto system known to man, or humankind. Another customer was using a particular type of one-time pad where they would memorize the 3 letters that were associated with the algorithm, which was based on something called a visionaire table. I had learned about cipher wheels in my intro to crypto classes, so I came up with this idea of making a cipher wheel with the 3 characters. So there was a hidden alphabet and a little window. Turns out the customer loved it. We ended up making 15,000 of them, and they were distributed to U.S. Special Forces, and they used them, as far as I could tell, for about a dozen years. Earlier this year, a version, one of the production models of the cipher wheel was put on display at the National Cryptological Museum at NSA headquarters. This is the display case, and down on the end there is the cipher wheel with the write up. I'm being a little bit goofy, but yeah, I'm in a museum. That's kind of cool. There's more to that story. You can go out on YouTube and find Tales from the Crypt Analyst. That was the first talk. Now, another date, more important to us. Anybody know what the significance is of this date? This date's really why we're here. Yes?
Where's work?
Close, but no. Nope. Another nice guess. Better guesses than I've had most of the year. This is the day that changed the world. This is not Skynet becoming self-aware, but the release of the first public browser, which is really what launched the internet to the masses and made the internet freely available. I was working in an office at the time at NSA that was doing fielded systems evaluations. And we very quickly became interested in distributed systems, which is what we called it back then, or in network systems. So what we ended up doing was starting a pen testing team, and that became the sort of the tale, which is the sequel, More Tales from the Crypt Analyst. We actually are a little bit famous. There's a book that came out some years ago called Dark Territory. In that book, chapter 4, which is entitled Eligible Receiver, there's a paragraph which states in part in the middle there, during its most sensitive drills, the Red Team worked out of a chamber called the Pit, which was so secret that few people at NSA knew it existed, and even they couldn't enter it without first passing through 2 combination locked doors. I don't know where that office was, but I do know that the office that I worked in with these guys that were doing pen testing, we nicknamed our office the Pit. I don't really know how that got into the book, but it is what it is. The Pit, I can tell you, was 6 different guys. I need to update this slide because one of the guys that stayed there, I learned earlier this year, is retired. 4 of us are out in the private sector. Two were still at NSA. The only other person that I'm allowed to and have permission to say was part of the Pit, this guy on the end here. Anybody know who that is?
Ron.
That's Ron Gula. He was the founder of a small startup company called Tenable. Anybody heard of Tenable? Nessus? Yep. So he came to work. He was in the Air Force at the time. He was sort of a latecomer to the Pit. And usually, we're still friends to this day. Usually when I'm introduced by him, I'm introduced as the guy that taught him his first pen tests. So, you know, Ron credits me to some degree for at least part of his career. So, there's the book, by the way, Bruce.
Thanks.
You're welcome. It's still available. You might still learn something from it. There wasn't a lot to go with back in those days. Computer hacking had been a thing. We learned a little bit earlier today from HD that a lot of it was done over phone line. In fact, all of it was done over phone lines. So there were some people that had made some interesting discoveries and written a couple books. These were sort of our guides as we were learning. Of course, famously, our inspiration was a book called The Cuckoo's Egg, written by Cliff Stahl, who was, you know, if you don't know the story, this is a book that you should read. He was a physicist, he was an astronomer, help me? Astronomer. Back in those days, universities had mainframes, and to do work on the mainframe, you had to sign up for time and you had to pay for your time. He was going over the bill and basically found like a 75-cent discrepancy, and as he started investigating it, it led to him discovering that there was computer hackers that had broken into the mainframe from the Eastern Bloc, Soviet Union, East Germany, and he kind of figured out how to track them down. Remember, this is all over phone lines, so he's doing forensics and tracking back using phone lines and over phone lines. Fascinating, this story. There's used to be a science fiction show, or not science fiction, a science show called Nova, and they did an episode of the Cuckoo's Egg. I think you can still find it on YouTube. If you're like me and you don't like to read books, you'd rather watch the movie, it's all out there. I put this in because the author, Win Schwartau, he was at a conference earlier this year, so I put this in mostly to razz him, but there's been fear, uncertainty, and doubt FUD from the very beginnings. Win Schwartau has been predicting the end of the world because of computers and the internet for a long time. Anyway, so we were doing pen testing, very briefly. It got to the point where this was becoming a thing. This was the mid-90s, early 90s, and people were starting to plug into the internet and trying to, worry about security a little bit. They knew something about hackers and bad guys, and they knew the internet was somehow bad. We portrayed the internet on network diagrams back in those days as a cloud because it was unknown, and that's where all the evil lurked. And of course, fast forward to today, everything's in the cloud. Why, I don't know. But anyway, we were approached at some point by the Department of Justice. They wanted us to do a pen test of their internet presence. And if you've ever worked for the government, it's a bureaucracy, and this is political, so there's a lot of bureaucratic red tape. So this was a months-long process trying to get to the point where we could actually do the pen test. This is the letter that was dated, as you can see up there, 21st of August, 1996. You can see I'm listed as the point of contact. This was going from the director of the National Security Agency back to the Department of Justice saying, yeah, we'll do it for you. Again, this process had started probably back in April. Unfortunately, before this letter could be delivered, these things are made out ahead of time and put before the director for signature, but he had signed it. This happened. The weekend before, the very first hack of the government happened, the very first defacement of a government website. Anybody remember this? This was a long time ago. Somebody broke into the website of the Department of Justice and defaced it and replaced the Attorney General, who was Janet Reno at the time, with Adolf Hitler. You scroll down, it gets a little bit more inappropriate, but you can find copies of this out there to this day. So I came in on Monday morning, got a phone call from the client at the Department of Justice. Help, we were hacked over the weekend. Can you come help us? I hung up the phone, got on the phone with the lawyers, the general counsel, explained to them what happened, and I said, how can we get somebody down there to help them? We can't be waiting 3 months. We need to get a team down there the next day, which we did. So on a Tuesday, a group of us from the pit went down and tried to help them diagnose and figure out what had happened. Back in those days, web servers were physical servers, and they were hosted by the people that actually owned them on the perimeter of their network, assuming that they had a firewall. And the first thing that these guys had done when they realized it had been hacked was they'd literally pulled the plug, they'd flushed the whole system and rebuilt it. So they eliminated most of whatever potential evidence was there. But that's another story. This is rare. We were not allowed to have cameras at Fort Meade or at NSA, and I found this also while I was cleaning up on a floppy disk. Anybody know what a floppy disk is? The best I can remember is that we had a chance to buy different technologies, and somebody had figured out how to order a digital camera. So these are actual pictures of my desk in the pit at NSA back in 1996. I might have had a mullet at the time, so I apologize. But my friends, they decided to, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Tuesday we're there, Wednesday we're there, Thursday we're there, I get a call, and somebody back at the pit says, Jeff, the shit's hit the fan, you gotta come back now. And so we drove back up to our office. We weren't technically at Fort Meade, but we were in that area. And we proceeded to be escorted into the deputy director's conference room and got read the riot act by the very lawyer that I'd been working with. And we were accused of doing all sorts of things illegal and doing things to get the director fired. And the gist of it was NSA's not supposed to do what NSA does to US citizens. That's come up, as an issue sometime in the last 10 or so years. But we were operating under something called the NSA Charter, which basically says NSA only does what NSA does to foreign nationals, not US citizens. And for the first time I heard something cited called the church proceedings. Little history lesson. Back in the early 70s, there was this thing called the Watergate break-in. It had to do with the elections and a break-in of the Democratic headquarters. After the Watergate thing, there was a congressional subcommittee formed, chaired by Senator Frank Church, and the upshot of their investigation was they determined that the three-letter agencies like NSA, FBI, and the CIA had a whole lot of power and capability with very little regulatory oversight. So thus was born regulatory oversight and the NSA Charter that says, NSA, you don't do what you do to US citizens. But we were accused of doing that because we were doing that ethical, good guy, white hat hacking, what we called at the time, and somebody got their nose out of joint. I don't know the exact story, but I, being the project leader, the ringleader, was put on double secret probation. I was investigated. I actually ran into the lawyer 5 or so years ago, more than that, because it was a couple years before COVID, but I ran into the lawyer that actually had been yelling at me, and we hadn't seen each other in 20 years, and he said, I forgive you. I'm like, why are you forgiving me? I've been pissed off at you for 20 years because you were yelling at us. Turns out he got into a whole lot more trouble than I did, and he was providing air cover, but he told me that they were not only trying to get me fired, they wanted to prosecute me. So anyway, that's why they quarantined my cubicle and put up the police tape. A month later, I was gone from NSA. The whole experience, while I was exonerated, kind of soured me on the whole process, and a bunch of us had been looking to go out into the private sector anyway for more pay, and we had illusions of becoming millionaires because we understood security and we could just go out and break into everything and tell people it was wrong and they'd fix it and we'd become rich and we were done. That's what we thought at the time. All of that, more of the story, more Tales from the Crypt. You can also find that out on YouTube. This is sort of sums up my experience at NSA because I did things that had never been done before, and I did things that literally I was told couldn't be done. Which brings us up to this talk today. So that's just the background. This is the third installment, which is what I did after NSA. And ironically, sort of the genesis of this talk is how somebody that was at NSA doing all that stuff ended up doing PCI, because everybody hates PCI. A bunch of us were looking to get out. We were talking to several different companies. There weren't that many security companies back in those days, but they were mostly big IT companies. Accounting firms were getting into the business. So these are some of the companies that I had been interviewing with. The government gave us an early out, so I was incentivized to leave by the end of September. They paid me to leave, so I took the first offer, which happened to be a company called CSC, doesn't exist anymore. Best thing about that experience was, because I only stayed there 6 months, I worked in the same office as this guy. Anybody know Johnny Long? But the guys that hired me, they quit like literally weeks after they brought me on, because they were going to go off to start their own practice at some other company that was doing more commercial work. That was sort of the mecca back in those days, was to get out in the private sector. The CSC was a government contractor at the time doing classified work adjacent to Fort Meade. So I ended up going to another company called Nichols Research. Again, a government contractor, but the person that I ended up working for had a more compelling story. It was a better opportunity to start focusing doing this stuff in the private sector. Because what we wanted to do was try to help companies figure out how to do security if they were going to plug into the internet and have the internet be their backbone. It was really easy back in those days. We would do the pen tests. We called them vulnerability assessments more often than not. We would come in and help them just do a review or architecture. And then we'd recommend they get a firewall, because back then that's about all there was. I think about this as I've given this talk at several conferences these years where there's huge vendor spaces. I'm like, the vendor space back then, there would have been like 2 tables, because there was like 2 firewalls on the market. At any rate, we set up a practice. We were trying to do cool stuff, pen testing, but really vulnerability architecture, vulnerability assessment. SANS was back in those days around. They used to put out these posters where they would talk about everything that could happen to your network. And it was all in just one 2-foot by 3-foot poster. And then all the different types of technologies that were out there, and aspects of things that you had to do. I don't know how many posters it would take these days. But we got listed as one of the security services that did penetration testing. Yay us. Back then it was more or less a pay-to-play, still is. So, but look at who's up there. No pen testing company that you know of today is up there. The accounting firms were getting into it, the big IT companies, and there was little old us. Methodology was really simple. We would try to find out what our targets were, try to learn a lot about our targets. We didn't have the terminology that we have today. We'd figure out what our best attack scenario is, and we'd try to break in. It was largely based on a movie that came out in the early 1990s called Sneakers. Has anybody seen Sneakers? Anybody not seen Sneakers? Add it, young people, add this to your canon, add this to your to-do list, because this movie basically depicts how most pen testing companies do pen testing today, or red teaming companies. In this movie, there's a scene where the bad guy, as it were, Ben Kingsley, is talking to Robert Redford, and he says something to the effect of, there's a war out there, Marty. It's a war not being fought with bullets and bombs, but with information. It's all about who owns the information. Everything you have, everything you know, everything you see, everything you do, it's all about the information. Kind of true today. Site survey, we didn't have all the tools that we have available. There wasn't, Google didn't exist yet. We had predecessors like Yahoo or Alta Vista, if you remember that. We would do probing of the networks. Back in those days, by the way, just about everything was internet addressable. We weren't really into private addressing yet, so you could scan the entire network and find all sorts of things. And sometimes they were behind firewalls, sometimes they weren't. And then we'd try to break in. There were some tools at the time. This was one of the early commercial vulnerability scanning tools called ISS. They eventually got acquired by IBM, but back then they mostly were focused on finding vulnerabilities, scanning the different types of things. What was out there at the time? The firewall, the perimeter, the web server, not a whole lot more than that. Real Secure was their attempt at doing intrusion detection systems. I never really saw it work that well. I had a client one time that had bought several appliances, and literally when we went to visit them, they were still in a box and they were actually being used to prop open the data center door. So we wrote them up for having the data center unlocked. They had really cool marketing. Somebody in their marketing department decided to do kind of a graphic novel. So they came out with this thing called Real Secure, Enterprises Under Siege. Now, ironically, the bad guy in the book is the woman, and the good guy is that demonic thing flying around. You can imagine that this didn't go over very well, those of us that are sensitive about sexism and things like that in our industry. So this got pulled very quickly, but I happened to have a copy and I thought this is going to be historically relevant, so I kept it. The back page, if you remember comic books back in those days, it had that kind of Charles Atlas kind of nod. It's fun to keep. I didn't want to use ISS. Everybody was using ISS. And around the time I went to work for this company, this guy up in Canada started a company called Secure Networks Incorporated. And they set up their website, and they had a different vulnerability scanner called Ballista. So I decided I'm going to start using Ballista. What was very common back in those days, I should say, another cool thing that came out of Secure Networks is a guy named Tom Tajcek, and he wrote the definitive book at the time. It was like a 70-page white paper on invading intrusion detection systems, which was the game of cat and mouse classically. So that was Secure Networks Incorporated. They lasted all of about 1 year, because back in those days, a security company would start up and some big IT company or IT services company would snatch them up because the belief was we want to have a one-stop shop. Cisco is an example. They've been trying to be a security company for over 30 years by buying up security companies. I know people who work at Cisco, I still tease them, why are you at a security conference? At any rate, it was pretty common back then. Network Associates was one of the companies that was buying up a lot of different companies. They bought up McAfee, you might have heard of them. PGP, somebody mentioned, it was an encryption tool, a sniffing tool. Sniffers back in those days were not software, they were hardware, they were appliances. The one that I used at NSA was about 50 pounds and you wheeled it around on its own cart. Again, not necessarily culturally sensitive marketing, but this was an actual, there used to be things called magazines. This was a magazine ad. We were not upset at the time that it was this scantily clad woman being portrayed as the hacker. We were upset that she was using Windows 95. Anyway, these are some of the companies that existed, some of the early pioneering real security companies that again, didn't last very long. TIS, Trusted Information Systems, was Maryland-based. That's where I lived. They were responsible for more or less the first commercial firewall. Wheel Group was started by a bunch of guys that had used to work in the Air Force down in Texas. And the Air Force at the time was responsible for the network for the military. And they had the first network operations center and the first security operations center down around San Antonio. And a bunch of them went off and started Wheel Group, which was sort of the first company to have detection tools that were decent, not like real secure. Trusted Information Systems, first firewall, the guy that wrote a lot of the code for the firewall worked there, Marcus Raynham. You might have heard of him. I actually interviewed there. I interviewed his wife who was running consulting, didn't end up going to work for them, but when they got acquired, they jettisoned the consulting group. So she ended up working for us at Nichols Research. So we had somebody, me from NSA, somebody from TIS, respected. You can see the list of people there. Did you ever use this, HD? Commercial version?
Yep.
Remember that? ToneLoc was the war dialer, and again, there was a lot of war dialing back then because a lot of the connectivity was still over phone lines, especially for network devices like routers and switches. They'd have modems for out-of-band connection if the network went down, which happened a lot, usually because of misconfigurations, but it happened a lot. So we used this commercial one called Phone Sweep, mostly because the lady that was responsible for the company, Becky Bass, she was our den mother when we were in the pit. She was the one that came in all the time to check in on us, see how we were doing. We were young kids. Most importantly, she was talking to the senior level management saying, you don't understand what the kids are doing, but you got to let them do what they're doing. She was also actually responsible for getting me into the cabal or the curmudgeons. She was the one that nominated me, and I was inducted in 2017, and she passed away like 2 months after I was inducted. So she holds a special place in my heart for my career and my history, but also for this industry. Again, for the young people, look her up. Learn about her. She was very much into forensics and intrusion detection and very pioneering in this business, especially if you're ladies in the business, you know, there's people that came before you. These are some of the clients I had back in those days. Obviously, there was a government affiliation. I mentioned this one. This was a government organization. It was run by the Army. And they had all the different mainframes, the best, fastest, most powerful computers at the time. And they hired us to try to break into the facility where they were housing these systems that were doing radical, amazing new things like streaming video and like, wow, you can like watch video on a computer. It was new back then, trust me. It was run by the Army, but they were on an Air Force base, and we had all the permissions from the Army. We had our get out of jail free card, but somebody forgot to tell the Air Force, who owned the network on the Air Force base. So we got called one morning after we started pen testing, and apparently there had been an Air Force cert advisory issued against us. I would love to get a hold of it. I have not been able to find it, but I would love to find that copy. I've got people looking at it. I've looked at the Wayback Machine. I found the page where it points to it, but because it was an Air Force cert advisory, it was considered confidential or classified at some level. Haven't found it yet. Anyway, how am I doing on time? Pretty good. We partnered with this company called Digex. Digex was an early hosting provider. Web farm, that was very common very quickly to have companies that would just, you know, you put all your, especially your web stuff out on a hosting facility. We were hired to do the assessments mostly for their customers. We were co-branded with their marketing material. If you remember, I had a slide earlier, we did the pen testing, we did the architectural work. The firewall installation, we didn't do that. We thought, you know, that's just technical, menial stuff. We farmed that out to this company called Riptech. Riptech was run by a guy named Amit Yoran, who's now CEO of Tenable. I used to work for Tenable, and I met Amit when he replaced Ron some years ago, and I was talking to him, I said, you know, I had never met him before, but I said, you know, we have sort of a common past. You know, I know you used to do Riptech. I used to work at Nichols. And he's like, oh my gosh, you were Nichols? I kind of have you to thank for my career, because when he was doing Riptech, he wasn't sure if this security thing was going to take off, whether it was just a fad or not. But he said to me, you guys were throwing me so much firewall work, I decided to stick with it. So I have this weird connection to Tenable, as it were, twice, with Ron and with Amit.
You know who bought Riptech? Guess.
Cisco. There you go. I never knew what happened to him, but thank you for sharing that. Digex got acquired, like everybody was getting acquired. They became Intermedia Communications. The guy that had owned it, Chris McCleary, he took his proceeds after the appropriate amount of time and started a company called US Internetworking, which was arguably one of the first cloud providers as we know them today. His idea back then was there's all sorts of enterprise level hardware, enterprise applications, things that are very expensive licenses, expensive to maintain, hardware, software. They would buy it all, host it, and just sort of lease out logins to it, licenses to it. So we went over to them. We were still their security architect. They were their security advisors. So we got co-branded. My favorite pen test happened while we were working with them. the guy that was their security manager, we didn't really call it CISOs back then, he got fed up trying to convince management that he needed more money and more stuff. So he gave us a weekend to try to break into them, kind of no holds barred. And I love that COVID happened, if for no other reason, that I finally cleaned out all my drawers and found all sorts of different stuff, including this is the actual pen test report that we wrote up. The time frame, it was 1998, yada, yada, yada. We got in, we did everything we wanted, and even though that they had a perimeter firewall, we weren't really impeded by it. And you go on in this report, talk about what we did. Unix was a common thing back then, and Windows NT was sort of new, but most everything back then was Unix-based. Unix is a predecessor of Linux for you younger people. Goes down at the bottom, how did we get in? We found a misconfigured SQL server. So how did we get in? SQL injection. As soon as we were in, we reverse tunneled out because intrusion detection systems back in those days were only looking at traffic going in. Anything that was initiated inside out was considered to be trusted. So we tunneled out, established a secure shell tunnel, and had unfettered access for the entire weekend. I took that Ballista tool that after they got acquired was rebranded as CyberCop Scanner, and I was looking around at the different servers that we had already gained access to, and I found one that was called TEM01, Tivoli Enterprise Monitoring 01. That was a tool at the time that was used for network monitoring. I'm like, I bet you that reaches everything, and I bet you it's trusted. So that's where we put the scanner, and we scanned their entire internal network. They had Real Secure installed. They never saw us. They never saw any activity. We came in with, I printed it. It was like an 800-page report, and gave it to them on the Monday morning. And they were not happy. We were able to crack a bunch of the Unix passwords. Of course, password security is a thing of the past. We don't have a problem with that anymore. Also, we were doing some of the, NT was kind of new, but we were using loft crack, and we were able to crack some of the NT passwords. The other irony with Ron Gula, he was working there at the time. He was on their security team. He was so fed up with how poorly Real Secure had worked, and whatever other tools that they had, he decided to go off and start his own company, write his own tool. So he ended up starting a company called Network Security Wizards and writing a tool called Dragon, which was sort of a predecessor of some other thing. What is it? Snort? There's a story there, but I won't get into that. So I also sort of motivated him to start him on his career path, because he did this first, took the proceeds of this company, because they lasted all of about 18 months before they were acquired, and he took that money to start Tenable. I got the bug at some point, like a bunch of us. In fact, it was one of our clients that had been from Digex that talked us into doing a startup, a .com startup. And so I went to work for a company called Meta Security Group, which was a spinoff of a company called Meta Group, which at the time was sort of a competitor to what you would know of today as Gartner or Forrester, sort of a research think tank. They think that producing content is worth thousands of dollars, even though it's just, like a white paper or something like that. But anyway, they wanted to do a security practice. They pulled us in. There isn't a whole lot of stories to tell about this time. We got rebranded like every 12 months with a different logo and a different name. They actually called us Metasys for a little while, which sounded a whole lot like a kind of cancer. So that didn't go over too well. But this happened while we were at Meta Security Group. 9/11 happened. And this was an amazing event from a cybersecurity perspective, because up until that point, we're going in as consultants and advisors trying to explain to them all the bad things that could happen. We go in and pen test and get root on all their systems, or domain access in modern terminology, and try to explain to them why that's bad. And none of our customers seem to be interested or care. But when this happened, when 9/11 happened, they're like, what? You mean the hypothetical can happen? Bad things can happen? And all of a sudden we had their attention. So it was a good time for us. And that attention span lasted all of probably 9 months. It was great. This is our website. Some of the cool things, some of you that are familiar with some of the better higher end pen testing companies, InGuardians being one of them. InGuardians, the founder, used to work for us at MetaSecurity Group. Bunch of the guys that came over with me from Nichols to MetaSecurity Group they went on to start their own company some years ago, but they've been running the password cracking contest at DEF CON for a lot of years. I'm not sure exactly how long. Another guy from our company is on the review board for Black Hat. So we had people that were in the know and have made a difference and have given back and continued on in the community. I was getting to the point there this is on about the time about 2004. So I've been out in the private sector for 8 years. And me being me, an analyst and a problem solver, a puzzle solver, I was getting frustrated that we would go and pen test a company and show them how we broke in, come back 6 months later and show them exactly the same thing, and they hadn't made any changes. They clearly weren't getting the message that they needed to think about security. There was a lot of, well, nothing bad has happened yet. Why would anybody go after us? We're a grocery store, we're a shoe store, whatever. The bad guys hadn't figured out how to monetize yet. A lot of the hacking that happened back then, the break-ins was like the DOJ hack. It was a website defacement. There wasn't anything stolen. It was a little bit of embarrassment, egg on the face, but nothing really bad had come out of it. So I was getting a little bit frustrated, trying to look for a different way to try to get to companies to help them understand why they needed to do this thing called security. And that's when I went to work for a company that originally, TrustWave was started by a bunch of ex-NSA guys. In fact, one of the founders of TrustWave used to work with me for like the first 6 months at Nichols. So, I knew one of the founders of TrustWave, so I ended up going to TrustWave. They immediately got acquired, merged with a company called Amberon, and that's when PCI came along. PCI, the payment card industry, is a data security standard that came out in 2004, and it was a standard that was intended to be used by all the different card brands for all their merchant customers to have some sort of base level of security to try to prevent credit cards from being stolen, because that was the early monetization thing of the bad guys. They stole credit cards. I think maybe HD alluded to this earlier in his talk today. You steal the credit cards to pay for the long distance bill. But eventually you could steal the credit cards and just sell them and make a whole lot of money. This is not a talk on PCI, but this PCI has 6 goals. Secure your network, build a secure network, secure all your stuff, protect the data it is that you care about, keep everything current using a vulnerability management program. That's where patching comes in. Limit access, both physically and logically, to the data that you care about. Monitor and do all the security things and have it all written down in a policy. That, in essence, is PCI. I kind of believe in that concept to this day, and this is what I've been going around for 20 years trying to explain to companies that will sit still and listen, which, by the way, because of PCI, they do have to sit still because they have to do it. These are some of the clients that I've had. Again, this is not a PCI talk, but I've had some pretty major clients over the last 20 years. Some names you probably recognize. Some names that are up there have gone through some rather public and major credit card breaches over the last couple years. The TJX company in particular, they're almost done with their 20 years of having to do extra Federal Trade Commission filing, because their breach happened, I think, in 2006 or 7. But I was called in there rather early on. The company I worked for at the time, we were called into a bunch of companies that were doing that PCI stuff back then and got breached, got stuff stolen. We're now up to version 4. That's the last thing I'm going to say about PCI. this is what I want to sum up with. I've given this talk as a keynote a couple times this year, and since I'm last, I consider this a closing keynote. So this is the part where you pay attention. These are slides that we used in 1998. This is an unaltered 26-year-old slide deck. This is what we used to use to go in and talk to companies about why they needed to start thinking about security and do security. We would talk about all the different pros and cons and why it's important to think about it. And we would talk about why you're insecure out of the gate. And we talk about what to do. We talked about security being a process, something that you did on an ongoing basis. This is one of the major disconnects to this day in our industry, because a lot of us believe, and a lot of our clients believe, and the companies we work for, that security is a place that you get to. It's a state. We got to secure all the things. We got to patch all the things. We got to get to that point of being secure. With the belief, we know it's not true, but people that believe if we could just be secure, that means nothing bad will happen, nothing will get stolen, nothing will get compromised. By the way, you don't have to take pictures of these slides. I'll have a QR code at the end. You can get the whole deck. But we would go in and say, no, this is something you need to think about. You need to know what it is that you want to protect, what you need to protect, to what degree do you want to protect it, who are the bad guys going after it. It was all based on something that I learned in my NSA days called a risk equation. But we would go in and talk about this cycle being about 12 to 18 months. And I would say the cycle still exists today, but now it's down to maybe 12 to 18 weeks, maybe 12 to 18 days, because we do move in a much faster, more interconnected world. Again, I'll just breeze through this, but if you want these slides, and they are 26-year-old slides, they're available. I'll give you a QR code at the end. But we were trying to hammer home, it's not just technology. Everybody just wanted to buy the firewall. What do I need to buy to put it in, and I don't have to think about security? And we were basically saying, no, security is something you need to think about. You need to have something in mind, a goal in mind, an objective in mind. Know the pros and cons, know what you can do and what you can't do, know how much you need to invest, where you need to invest it, because you don't have enough to invest, and so on and so forth. We also talked about you need to have it kind of written down in terms of a policy, a plan. You know, have something written down that's repeatable, have stated goals. I still kind of believe in that. And this is why, well, a security policy, this is what mostly is still true today. Policy has to be updated for PCI. I go in every year to my clients and I see that the policy's been reviewed the week before I show up on site, and all 50 policies have been reviewed on the same day. People largely look at this as an exercise, a paper exercise. I try to teach my clients, no, write it in such a way that you can use it. You can use it to teach your people that are assigned to do the things, and try to teach them the big picture. I don't know if I succeeded or not ultimately, but I still try. We try to make a business case for why you should do security and what you need to put into it, why things are failing. A lot of people don't buy into it even to this day. Lack of enforcement is still a problem to this day. How many people, be honest, have worked for an organization where you've got some sort of phishing campaigns that go on periodically? How many people have failed at least once? Did you get fired? Did you get reprimanded? Or did you have to watch a 5-minute video that tells you, don't click on the fit? Okay. Oh, the last one. It's not the technology. You got to focus on the people. And then we tried to talk about what you can do to succeed. And security is not always taken seriously. That's sort of the bottom line. And there's people that are considered to be exempt from it. And usually the worst offenders, if we're honest with ourselves, are the IT people first, but the security people ultimately. I will also say back then we were wrong in that we were building this model of security based on a military model of protecting things that we assume are deep in the bowels of our internal network, on a mainframe or in a database that will come nowhere near to the light of day of that cloud, the internet. And it's based on principles that go back thousands of years on, you build your castle with moats around it and layers of security. Imagine this is defense in depth. We've heard all the terminology. But obviously this day, that's not where our information is. But even back then, it wasn't good enough to just have that approach. These slides, I'll leave these with you. These are more from Meta Security Group, so they're probably from about 2002. So they're still at least 20 years old. But these are sort of the final shots. 5 worst security mistakes that end users make. Opening unsolicited email attachments. That's what it was back then. Now it's clicking on the link. Same principle, even though the technique has changed a little bit. Patches, still a problem. I don't know why I skipped installing screensavers or unauthorized applications, but that's probably should still be added. Not making backups, not testing your backups. Using a modem. There's not that many modems out there anymore, but just replace Wi-Fi with modems, using untrusted Wi-Fis, untrusted networks. 7 worst security mistakes that senior executives make. They don't get it. They rely primarily on fill in the blank. Back then it was the firewall. But fill in the blank of security product. How many boxes? What color is the blinky light? Just tell me I'm okay because that's in place. And there's still a lot of, well, it hasn't happened to us yet, so why should we worry about it? And then finally, it's the 10 worst security mistakes that the IT people make. Let's be honest. I won't read them all to you. That's kind of the gist of it. I did want to add this at the end. I was in Edmonton, Alberta a couple weeks ago, gave this talk, and I was there over a weekend. I was at B-Sides Edmonton, and I visited basically a museum that was dedicated to Indigenous people. Canada treated their Indigenous people very poorly, even in some ways worse than the US treated our Indigenous people. And somewhere in the display, they were talking about the elders of the community. It was a really cool thing. And I grabbed a couple of these quotes because I thought, people are always asking me, why do you call yourself a curmudgeon? That has such a negative connotation. And I kind of like these definitions. Think of me as an old person and think of me as an elder. And then I think this fits better. So, if you meet a curmudgeon, hopefully it's people that are teaching you and that have gone before you that have learned the valuable life lessons. Anyway, there's the QR code if you want to grab that. Am I in the way of anybody? I mean, these are, I used these slides about 10 years ago for a talk, and I didn't tell people that it was an old set of slides. It was just, this is the state of information security today. And at some point I said, oh, by the way, this is an 18-year-old slide deck. Now it's 28-year-old slide deck. If you want to learn more about my story, there's also a 3-hour podcast that I was interviewed by something called the Team House. If you just search Team House NSA, they let me talk for 3 hours, and beyond even the B-sides talks on mostly the NSA stuff. And I had put stickers out. There's a few left. There might be some back on the back table, but I do have stickers it used to be for all 3 of the talks. I think I'm just down to this one. If you're into stickers, look for them. There might still be some around, and 5 minutes or whenever they want to start the closing ceremonies, I would be happy to take questions. Yes, sir. I'm obligated to say, please use the microphone.
Oh, right. Okay, so there you are. Is this on?
No.
All right, so there you are in IAD making like awesome Legionnaire ciphers better. Mm-hmm. I guess it makes sense to me that work is in the Information Assurance Directorate. What social or cultural factors the first Red Team being seeing some dude showing up at Fanix and working there, as opposed to, like, you know, on the offensive kind of team at the fort, right? That like there must be something fascinating that led to that happening.
There probably is something fascinating. We didn't call ourselves the Red Team. We were at Fanix. You did recognize the building. It probably said Fanix. And we were technically not IAD yet. That was Information Assurance Directorate. We were still the Information Security Directorate, ISD. In fact, when I started in '86 with the Visioneer ciphers, we were still ComSec, Communication Security. It changed to InfoSec within the first year or two I was there. So pet peeve of mine, I believe defense is all that security is. I don't believe there is such a thing as offensive security and defensive security. It's all defensive by design. So it's hard for me not to comment on this without triggering me on a couple pet peeves. So we didn't call ourselves a Red Team, we called ourselves hackers. We called ourselves pen testers, and we were really doing vulnerability assessments, by today's terminology. And I still don't really get, I ask people all the time, what's the difference between pen testing and red teaming? And I have yet to get a definitive answer. Although I've had many people tell me, this is the definitive answer. I'm like, yeah, but the other guy just said pretty much the opposite. So, but we were in an organization on the defensive side that was doing fielded systems evaluations. The reason we existed was because somebody figured out that the way that the offensive side of NSA, which is what most people know NSA for, intercepting communications and doing the decoding and the decrypting if necessary, but creatively finding ways of collecting information. Somebody, and I don't know who it was, put 2 and 2 together and said, the way that we often exploit the systems of the adversary is we're taking advantage of the fact that they are misusing it in some way. Like a one-time pad, which is the random key is on a piece of paper. If you use it once and you send the message and there's a second copy on the other end, and as long as those 2 copies aren't compromised, there's no way to computationally, mathematically brute force and get to a solution. It's unbreakable, which is hard to imagine because everything we use these days on the internet, while big, is theoretically breakable. Theoretically, there is a brute force solution. So people would reuse the one-time pad instead of once. They use it for a week or a month and send multiple messages. That introduces cryptographic vulnerabilities. If it was machines and equipment, they'd find bypasses. They wouldn't set the switches correctly. They would use it incorrectly. They wouldn't change default settings. There was something about the systems that was misused, not by design, which was exploitable. So somebody thought, how do we know that our military is using the systems that we've designed the way we design them? So we had different branches of this office that were looking at different aspects, one of which was distributed systems, network systems. And one of the guys I worked with is like, we're effectively doing pen testing, why don't we just call it pen testing? So that's how it got started. We were actually on Fort Meade at the time, and you seem to know a little bit about it, so I'll throw it out there. We were in the S building, which was the InfoSec building, Ops 3 on Fort Meade, which they kicked us out of at some point, and that's when we moved up to Fanix, and that's when we officially moved into a new office, and we dubbed it the Pit. So the Pit formed in, I think we moved in 94, maybe 95. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that was awesome.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Do you still for fun?
I don't have fun. You don't need to get up.
I just wanted to ask, are you still interested in, and do you crack codes and ciphers, cryptographic puzzles for fun?
Every once in a while. I mean, I still enjoy it, but there's classic puzzles that have never been broken that I look at every once in a while.
I was only interested because I'm also really interested in cryptography, and if you are interested, I'd like to share a cryptographic puzzle I made just to see if you'd like to give any feedback, because I assume you're more well-versed in different
Sure, I'd be happy to do
graphic
that.
algorithms, et cetera. Is your email listed on the website provided during this presentation?
Should be, or I can give you a card afterwards.
Thank you.
Or, use your OSINT and find me. I don't hide myself.
I can do that.
Yeah, who's closing? Can I tell one more story? Who's in charge here?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, thank you, Russ. So a lot of people ask me how I got into cybersecurity. We ask that on the podcast of our interviewees all the time. When people would ask me that, I'd say, well, I worked at NSA. But at some point I thought that's not a good answer. It's how did I get to NSA? And how I got to NSA was I filled out an application and they brought me in and I took a bunch of aptitude tests and skills tests. But what was it about me that got me at the NSA is I grew up in a household that loved to do puzzles. So I've always loved to do puzzles, crossword puzzles, various types of puzzles. Dell crossword puzzle magazines were a thing back when I was a kid. I think it's still available online. Are they still there? When we would go on family vacations, my dad would buy a Dell crossword puzzle and we'd pass it around and everybody had their favorite things. Everybody know what a crossword puzzle is. There's a diagramless crossword puzzle where not only are you guessing what the words are, but you also have to fill out the grid because it starts as a blank grid and you have to figure out what to black out and where the words go and how they get connected. I love doing that kind of stuff. My brothers and my dad and I, we all loved doing the logic problem. Every Dell crossword puzzle would always have one or two logic problems. And we would fight to do the logic problem, but what my dad ended up doing was we weren't allowed to write our answers in the magazine itself. We would have to have graph paper or extra sets of paper to work it out, but we all loved the logic problems. So fast forward, I get hired by NSA and I had to actually go on an interview to find an assignment. And my first interview was in this office that was called Manual Cryptosystems Branch, which is where I did the cipher wheel and where I did the semi-automated one-time pad. There was a guy there that was a Crypt Analyst, and he was on a diversity tour from the ops side of the house. And he was there reviewing their manual crypto systems. And he told me, let me see who are you interviewing with, because it was basically, it wasn't even job interviews. It was like I was talking to a bunch of used car salesmen in all these different offices. And he's like, yeah. He's like, let me see the list. I'm showing him all the different offices. And he's like, no, you don't want to work there. Oh, God, no, you don't want to work there. Oh, you could work there. And he's like, but really at the end of the day, this place is pretty cool. They wanted to hire me and train me up as a crypt analyst so I could do a review of the manual systems. So that's what I ended up doing. And he was there and became my mentor. And I don't know how many months I was there. One time it was lunchtime, we were taking a break, and he was doing something on break. And I asked him what he was doing. And he says, oh, as a side job, I write crossword puzzles for Dell Crossword Puzzle magazine. So that's my cathartic moment. So I'll leave you with that. That's how I ended up where I am, and it was proven by my mentor. All right? All right, thank you, everyone.